Korean Mafia boss entered a hospital to finish the job, but the doctor was the woman who saved him 15 years ago. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Memorial flickered with a rhythmic, clinical indifference, casting long, sterile shadows across the intensive care unit. Usually, the hallway was a symphony of soft-soled shoes and the melodic hum of heart monitors, but tonight, the air had turned brittle. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment the heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. Seo Dongwon did not walk, he reclaimed space. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who had long ago traded his soul for absolute power. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal black suit that absorbed the light around him, he was a dark stain on the hospital's pristine white canvas. His presence was an icy authority, sharpened by 2 decades of surviving the blood-soaked streets of Seoul. Beside him, 2 silhouettes followed, men with hollow eyes and hands tucked suggestively inside their jackets, but they were merely shadows. All eyes were fixed on Dongwon. As he moved deeper into the wing, the transformation of the environment was instantaneous. A young nurse, clutching a tray of medication, caught one glimpse of his piercing, obsidian eyes and froze. The tray rattled in her hands, the glass vials clinking like a frantic warning. She didn't ask for his ID, she didn't even breathe. She simply backed against the wall, her head bowed as if a dark god was passing by. The veteran security guard at the station, a man who had seen his share of bar fights and rowdy patients, felt a primal instinct scream at him to intervene. He took one step forward, his hand hovering near his belt, but as Dongwon's gaze swept over him. Cold, vacant, and utterly lethal, the guard's courage dissolved into a cold sweat. There was no emotion in the kingpin's face, no anger, no malice. There was only the terrifying calm of a man who had already decided that anything standing in his way was already dead. Dongwon didn't look at the signs or the room numbers. He knew exactly where he was going. His target was in room 402, a man who had dared to survive an ambush that should have been his end. To the world, this was a hospital, a sanctuary for the broken. To Dongwon, it was merely the final stage of a transaction that needed to be closed. He reached the heavy door of the ICU, his leather gloves creaking softly as he flexed his fingers. Behind that door lay the final loose thread of his empire. He raised a hand to the handle, his posture controlled and regal, ready to deliver a cold finality to a long-standing debt. He had come to be the Reaper, and in his world, the Reaper never missed his mark. Inside room 402, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator. Dr. Alara Hensley didn't need to look at the clock to know she was entering her 19th hour on shift. The dark circles under her eyes were a testament to a night spent fighting for lives that hung by a thread, but her hands, currently adjusting in 4-drip, were as steady as stone. She was a woman built on quiet strength, a pillar of compassion that had weathered 1,000 storms in this very ward. The sudden silence from the hallway hit her before the shadow did. The muffled chaos of the ward, the frantic whispers, the retreating footsteps, had vanished, replaced by a void so heavy it felt physical. Ilara turned away from the monitor just as the heavy door began to groan open. She saw the flash of a dark suit, the glint of polished shoes, and the unmistakable, suffocating aura of violence entering her sanctuary. She didn't retreat. She didn't scream. Instead, Ilara stepped forward, placing her body directly between the bed and the man in the doorway. "You can't be in here," she said. Her voice was low, filtered through exhaustion, yet it carried an ironclad authority that stopped the men in their tracks. Seo Dongwon stood in the threshold, his silenced weapon partially drawn, his eyes like twin shards of ice. He was used to people crumbling at his feet, he was used to the scent of fear. But the woman in front of him didn't smell like fear. She smelled of soap and fatigue and a stubborn, irrational bravery. "Step aside, doctor," one of the men behind Dongwon hissed, his hand reaching for his waistband. "This doesn't concern you." Ilara felt the cold sweat prickle at the back of her neck, but she didn't budge an inch. She adjusted her stance, her white coat a stark barrier against their black suits. Everything in this room concerns me. I have a patient under my care who is in critical condition. You are not a relative, you are not staff, and you are not taking another step toward this bed. She looked directly at Dong Huan, refusing to let her gaze drop to the weapon she knew was there. In that moment, she wasn't just a doctor, she was the personification of the Hippocratic Oath, a living shield for the helpless. I don't care who you are or what he did to you, she whispered, her voice trembling with the sheer force of her conviction. In this room, life is sacred. And as long as I am standing, you will not touch him. Dong Huan tilted his head slightly, his obsidian eyes narrowing as he studied the woman who dared to defy the Reaper. For the first time in years, the kingpin hesitated. There was something about the way she held her ground, something familiar in the tilt of her chin, that caused a strange, forgotten static to flicker in the back of his mind. The silence in the room was a living thing, stretched to its breaking point. Xiao Donghuan raised his hand, the sleek, matte black barrel of his pistol catching the harsh clinical light. He was a man of absolute efficiency. He didn't enjoy the theatrics of a standoff, and he certainly didn't let anyone, especially not a lone woman, derail his timeline. His finger found the trigger, the cold metal feeling natural against his skin. Last warning, he murmured, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Step away, and you live to see the sun. Elara didn't move. Her heart thundered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she reached out, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of the patient's bed as if to anchor her soul to her duty. As she did, the sleeve of her lab coat rode up just an inch, and the overhead fluorescent light washed over the back of her hand. Dong Huan's thumb stalled on the safety. There, etched across the delicate skin of her right hand, was a jagged, silver-white scar. It wasn't a surgical mark. It was the mark of a jagged piece of glass, a souvenir of a night filled with fire and the smell of burning rubber. A sudden, violent memory crashed into Dong Huan's mind, drowning out the steady beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor. He was 25 again, pinned under the wreckage of a car, blood blinding him as the sirens of his enemies wailed in the distance. He remembered a pair of small, trembling hands reaching into the twisted metal, not to kill him, but to pull him out. He remembered a girl, barely more than a student, shielding him with her own body as shards of glass rained down, one of them slicing deep into her hand as she dragged him into the safety of a rain-drenched alley. He remembered her whispering, "Stay with me. You're going to live," as she used her own scarf to bind his wounds, never asking who he was or what he had done to deserve such a fate. The pistol in his hand suddenly felt like a ton of lead. Dong Huan looked up from the scar to Elara's face, searching the features he had seen in his fevered dreams for over a decade. The youthful softness was gone, replaced by the lines of a woman who had seen the world's pain, but the eyes, the fierce, unyielding amber of her eyes, were exactly the same. The Reaper's hand began to lower. Behind him, his men shifted, confused by the sudden lapse in their leader's lethal momentum. "Boss," one of them whispered, his hand reaching for the door. "What are we doing?" Dong Huan didn't answer. He was staring at Elara as if she were a ghost, his icy resolve evaporating in the heat of a 15-year-old debt. He wasn't looking at a doctor anymore, he was looking at the only person who had ever treated his life as something worth saving. The sterile white walls of the ICU seemed to dissolve, replaced by the suffocating darkness of a sole alleyway 15 years prior. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and iron. Rain fell in unrelenting sheets, washing the blood from the asphalt only to reveal more beneath. A younger Xiao Donghuan lay crumpled against a rusted dumpster, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He was a nobody then, a mid-level soldier left for dead after a betrayal that had turned the streets into a slaughterhouse. His leg was mangled, a deep gash in his side was pouring his life onto the pavement, and the headlights of his pursuers were already cutting through the fog at the mouth of the alley. Then, he heard the splash of footsteps. He had expected a final bullet. Instead, he saw a girl. Elara was barely 20, her medical trainee scrub soaked through, her eyes wide with a terror she was clearly fighting to suppress. She had been taking a shortcut home when she stumbled upon the wreckage of his life. "Don't move," she had whispered, her voice shaking as much as her hands. She didn't run for help, she knew the men in those black sedans weren't the police. As the engines roared closer, she grabbed Dong Juan by his blood-slicked jacket and hauled him with a strength born of pure adrenaline. She dragged him behind a stack of discarded crates just as a spotlight swept over the spot where he had been lying seconds before. Dong Juan watched through half-closed lids as she worked in the dark. The shadows were her only sanctuary. To keep him quiet, she had pressed her hand over his mouth, her palm warm against his cold skin. With her other hand, she reached for a piece of broken glass that had caught in his sleeve, using it to cut her own scarf into bandages. In the frantic scramble to hide him deeper in the shadows, a jagged piece of metal from the dumpster had sliced upward, catching the back of her right hand. She didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. She just tightened the bandage around his waist, her blood mingling with his. "Why?" he had managed to wheeze, looking at the girl who was risking an execution for a stranger. "Because you're breathing," she replied simply, her amber eyes reflecting the distant, flickering street lamps. "And while you're breathing, you're my responsibility." She had stayed with him until the sun began to bleed through the smog of the city, hiding him until his own loyalists finally found the alley. By the time Dong Juan was pulled to safety, the girl had vanished into the morning mist, leaving behind nothing but a stained scarf and the memory of a courage he didn't think existed in their world. Now, 15 years later, the ghost of that night was standing in front of him again. The same amber eyes. The same stubborn chin. And the same scar, a permanent record of the night she chose to save a monster. The silence in room 402 was no longer the silence of an execution. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a debt coming due. Dong Juan lowered the weapon completely, the metal clicking softly against his thigh as he tucked it back into his holster. His men exchanged panicked glances, but a single, sharp raise of his hand froze them in place. He took a step forward. Elara flinched, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for a blow, but she didn't retreat. She stood her ground even as the most dangerous man in Seoul moved into the pool of light beside her. "The rainy season in Seoul," Dong Juan said. His voice wasn't the jagged blade it had been moments ago. It was a low, gravelly rasp, haunted by the ghost of a younger man. 15 years ago. An alleyway in Mapogu. Elara's breath hitched. The clinical mask of the doctor began to crack, her eyes widening as she searched the face of the kingpin. She had spent a decade and a half trying to bury that night, the night she had saved a man who looked like he had been chewed up by the devil himself. "You," she whispered, the word barely a breath. I thought you were just a dream. A nightmare I'd survived." "I was a ghost," Dong Juan replied, his dark eyes fixed on the silver scar on her hand. "But you gave that ghost a second life. You didn't ask for my name. You didn't ask if I deserved to live. You just bled with me." For the first time since he had entered the hospital, the icy authority in his posture fractured. He looked at her not as a target or an obstacle, but with a raw, terrifying reverence. "I have spent 15 years looking for the woman with the amber eyes and the scar on her hand," he said, taking another half-step toward her. "I thought I would find you in a church, or a quiet home. I never imagined I'd find you standing in front of my gun, protecting a piece of filth that isn't worth your breath." Elara's eyes filled with tears, though she refused to let them fall. "He's a human being, Dong Juan. That's what I told you then, and that's what I'm telling you now. My oath hasn't changed in 15 years. Has yours?" Dong Juan looked at the man in the bed, a rival who had tried to have him killed 3 times, and then back at the woman who had saved him once. The logic of the underworld demanded blood. The logic of the empire demanded finality. But as he looked at Elara, the weight of the life she had given him felt heavier than any crown he had ever worn. "My oath was to the shadows," he murmured, his voice softening until it was almost intimate. "But I think I've owed a different debt for a very long time. The fragile moment of connection was shattered by the heavy thud of the ICU doors being kicked open. 3 more men, led by Dongwon's second-in-command, Jae-ho, stormed into the cramped room. Their faces were flushed with the adrenaline of the hunt, their eyes darting impatiently toward the bed. Jae-ho, a man whose ambition had always been poorly masked by his loyalty, stopped short when he saw his boss standing unarmed next to the doctor. "Boss, what's the hold-up?" Jae-ho barked, his voice echoing off the sterile tiles. "The police are 5 minutes out. Move the woman and let's end this. We have a car waiting." Dongwon didn't move. He didn't even turn his head. "The job is cancelled, Jae-ho. We're leaving." The air in the room instantly curdled. The men behind Jae-ho shifted, their hands hovering over their weapons. In the underworld, a command to retreat when the target was within reach was more than a change of heart, it was a sign of a terminal weakness. Jae-ho's eyes narrowed, flickering from Dongwon to the trembling but defiant Alara. "Cancelled?" Jae-ho sneered, a dangerous edge creeping into his tone. "We lost 4 men getting you into this building. The council expects a head tonight, Dongwon. If you've gone soft over some hospital girl, then maybe you've been on the throne too long." Before the sentence was finished, Jae-ho drew his weapon, aiming it directly at Alara's chest. "Step aside, doctor. This is your last chance to play hero." Alara's breath hitched, but she didn't move. She felt the heat of the bedside monitor behind her and the cold weight of the Reaper's gaze beside her. She was trapped in the center of a 3-way standoff. The traitors hungry for blood, the dying man in the bed, and the monster who had suddenly found his memory. "Put the gun down, Jae-ho," Dongwon said, his voice dropping to a register that made the glass vials on the counter vibrate. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. "Or what?" Jae-ho challenged, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're going to kill your own brothers for a woman you haven't seen in a decade? Move, or she dies first." For Alara, the world narrowed down to the black circle of the gun barrel. But as Jae-ho took a step forward, Dongwon moved with a speed that defied his age. He stepped in front of Alara, his massive frame eclipsing her entirely, shielding her with the same reckless disregard she had shown him in that Mapogu alley 15 years ago. "She is the reason I am standing here," Dongwon whispered, the ice returning to his eyes, but this time it was directed at his own. "And if you want to touch her, you'll have to go through the man she created." The tension in the room snapped like a bone. Before Jae-ho could pull the trigger, Dongwon's hand shot out, gripping the barrel of the subordinate's gun and wrenching it upward. The muffled thud of a suppressed shot buried itself in the ceiling tiles, raining white dust down like morbid snow. With a brutal shove, Dongwon sent Jae-ho stumbling back into the hallway. In one fluid motion, the kingpin stepped out of the room and grabbed the edge of the heavy, reinforced ICU door. He looked back at Alara for a fraction of a second, a look that wasn't a goodbye, but a silent command to stay down. Then, he slammed the door shut, the magnetic lock engaging with a definitive, metallic clack. Inside, Alara was encased in a sudden, artificial silence. Outside, the sanctuary became a slaughterhouse. Through the narrow frosted glass of the door, Alara watched the distorted shadows of violence. She heard the heavy thud of bodies hitting the walls and the splintering of plastic chairs. Dongwon was no longer a man, he was a barrier. He stood in the center of the narrow corridor, a solitary black pillar holding back a tide of his own making. Jae-ho's men scrambled, their voices rising in a mixture of confusion and rage. "He's lost it. Take him down." But Dongwon fought with a terrifying, focused precision. This wasn't the chaotic brawl of a street soldier. It was the calculated defense of a man protecting the only sacred thing he had left. Every time a shadow tried to reach for the door handle, Dongwon was there to intercept, his blows landing with the weight of 15 years of repressed debt. He utilized the cramped space of the hallway, turning the very walls of the hospital into weapons, ensuring that not a single soul crossed the threshold into Alara's territory. Blood smeared the frosted glass from the outside, a grisly reminder of the world Donghuan belonged to, but the door held firm. Elara sank to her knees behind the bed, her hands over her ears, yet her eyes remained fixed on that door. She realized then that he wasn't just fighting his men, he was fighting his own nature. For the first time in his life, Xiao Donghuan wasn't killing to gain, he was bleeding to preserve. The Reaper had closed the gates of death, and for as long as he breathed, nothing was coming through that door. While the corridor outside erupted in a muffled cacophony of bone-crushing impacts and desperate shouts, a new sound filled the room, the piercing, rhythmic scream of a flatlining heart monitor. The patient was crashing. The stress of the intrusion had sent the target's weakened heart into a lethal rhythm. Elara's instincts, honed by years of trauma medicine, overrode her terror. The man in the hallway was shedding blood to keep the world out, but inside these four walls, death was already slipping through the cracks. "Not on my watch," Elara hissed, her voice cracking but determined. She scrambled to her feet, her hands flying over the medical cart. She needed to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis, a needle aspiration to drain the fluid suffocating the patient's heart. Every time a heavy body hit the ICU door from the outside, the walls shuddered, vibrating the very tray of sterile instruments she relied on. A loud crack echoed, the sound of the door's outer glass fracturing, and Elara flinched, her hand hovering inches from the patient's chest. She looked at the door, seeing the silhouette of Donghuan pressed against it, his shadow vast and protective even as three men tried to tear him away. "Focus, Elara," she whispered to herself. "He's doing his job. Do yours." With a steadying breath that tasted of copper and ozone, she gripped the long needle. The room felt like an island in the middle of a hurricane. Outside, the man she had saved was becoming a monster to protect her, inside, she had to remain a healer to justify his sacrifice. She palpated the patient's ribs, found the landmark, and pushed the needle in. The hallway fell into a sudden, eerie silence, followed by a guttural roar from Donghuan that sounded less like a man and more like a cornered beast. Just as a heavy boot kicked the door with enough force to warp the frame, Elara hit the pocket of fluid. Dark blood began to fill the syringe. Slowly, the frantic, jagged lines on the monitor began to smooth into a steady, life-giving pulse. Thump thump. Thump thump. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the bed rail, gasping for air as the adrenaline began to ebb. Her lab coat was stained with sweat and the patient's blood, her hands finally beginning to shake. She had done it. She had saved the life Donghuan had come to take, and she had done it while he stood guard over her soul. The chaos outside began to fade into a series of retreating footsteps and the heavy, ragged breathing of a single man. The shadow at the door remained still, slumped slightly against the glass, refusing to move until he was certain the sanctuary was secure. The magnetic lock disengaged with a weary click, and the door groaned open. Xiao Donghuan stood in the frame, his silhouette tattered. His charcoal suit was torn, and a deep crimson stain bloomed across his white shirt, but his eyes were clear, the icy vacancy had been replaced by a grim, grounded focus. Behind him, the hallway was a graveyard of broken glass and unconscious men, none of whom would be waking up any time soon. He didn't enter. He respected the threshold of her sanctuary. "It's over," he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion. As Elara stepped toward him, her eyes searching his for injuries, Donghuan's phone vibrated. He answered, listening in silence as a loyal contact from the outside delivered the final piece of the puzzle. His jaw tightened. The hit on this rival hadn't been a matter of business, it had been a setup by Jeho and a splinter faction of the council. They had sent Donghuan here knowing he would be trapped by the police, intended for him to die in a sterile hallway so they could seize his throne. He looked at the man in the bed, the target, who was now a secondary detail in a much larger betrayal. They didn't just want him dead, Donghuan murmured, more to himself than to Elara. They wanted to turn this place into my tomb. If you hadn't stopped me, I would have been looking at a barrel, not a patient, when they arrived. The debt had doubled. She hadn't just saved his life 15 years ago, she had saved his honor tonight by preventing him from walking into his own execution. Dongwon moved with sudden, efficient purpose. He pulled a radio from one of the fallen men and barked a series of commands. Within minutes, cleanup crews disguised as maintenance workers appeared from the service elevators. They worked with ghostly silence, removing the unconscious traders and wiping the blood from the frosted glass. He ensured the terrified nurses were ushered back to their stations with a quiet, terrifying promise that no harm would come to them, and that the night's events would be scrubbed from every security hard drive in the building. He turned back to Alara, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black card embossed with a gold crane, the symbol of his private estate. The police will arrive in 3 minutes. They will find a quiet hospital and a patient recovering from a standard cardiac event, he said, stepping back into the shadows of the corridor. But if the shadows ever move toward you again, Alara. If you ever find yourself in an alleyway with no way out, use this. I have spent 15 years living on borrowed time. From now on, that time belongs to you. He gave her a single, sharp nod, a king's salute to his savior, and vanished into the dark, leaving her standing in a room that felt too quiet, holding the weight of a mafia's debt in the palm of her scarred hand. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the hospital's break room, yet the memory of that night still felt as sharp as a scalpel. St. Jude's Memorial was peaceful, eerily so. In a city where the ER usually hummed with the casualties of gang wars and street violence, a strange, invisible curtain had been drawn around the neighborhood. The sirens still wailed, but the trauma of the underworld seemed to bypass their doors entirely. Alara sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the faded scar on her right hand. On the corner of her blotter lay the signature black card with the gold crane. She had never used it, never called the number etched into the back, but she felt its weight every time she walked to her car at 3 a.m. The dark alleys that used to feel like gauntlets were now bathed in the glow of new streetlights, and a black sedan was always parked a block away, moving only when her own taillights vanished into the distance. She stood up to check on her morning rounds and found a small, unmarked envelope tucked under her stethoscope. Inside was no note, just a deed to a new, state-of-the-art community clinic in the heart of Mapogu, the very district where they had met 15 years ago. The signature at the bottom was a simple, bold stroke of ink that she recognized without reading. Seo Dongwon was gone from the headlines, but his presence was felt in the silence of the city. He had not become a saint, but he had become a guardian. The Reaper had redefined his territory. The hospital was no longer a place of business, but a sanctuary where even his enemies were granted the mercy of life, simply because a woman with amber eyes once decided he was worth the effort. Alara looked out the window at the bustling street below. She saw a group of children playing in a park that had once been a drug den, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of her exhaustion. She had saved a monster, and in return, he had saved a city. As she stepped back into the ICU, the rhythmic thump-thump of the heart monitors sounded like a promise. The debt was settled, the walls had crumbled, and in the space between the light and the shadows, a new kind of peace had taken root.